Now, at this point, my brain was like, hang on, this sounds a bit utopian. I remember one of my bullies at school, he'd have been even more of a douche bagel if they'd had no system in place to control him. So I showed my brain this article about Ian Mercado High School, a school in the East End of London for boys who've been deemed unteachable.
The most difficult boys in Britain.
He got in fights, he hit the teachers.
Shut your mouth before I burn your face.
These are kids who have serious behavioural problems, some of which are among the most troubled in the country, and all of which have been expelled from previous mainstream schools. And how do they control these kids? Well, they don't.
In the video, you raised this question about Sudbury being utopian, but then you entered this story about this, I guess it was like a British reform school that had adopted a less authoritarian approach to dealing with some really difficult students. Would you mind just taking a minute or so to relay that to my audience? Because I thought that was really important.
I found this documentary, a couple of episodes of this school. I think it was called the Ian Mercado High School in London. And they took some of the most, literally the most, what was they called unteachable students, and brought them all together into this school to try and teach them. And initially, before this new headmistress with this kind of, more of a, similar to the Sudbury model, more of an open approach to teaching came along, 97%, I think it was, of the students went to prison. And after she came along and stopped enforcing them and like pushing them into classrooms every time and like making them do things and kind of instead giving them more freedom over their own learning and choosing what they actually did with their lives, 0% of them went to prison, and a large portion of them went on to further education or employment. And it's just a hell of a insight into what can happen if you give, like, particularly some of the people who people would reference as reasons not to do this type of education.
Right.
Like that can fix those people's lives.
Yeah, it's almost a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy too, right? We need this kind of strict, top-down, authoritarian, rule-driven education because look at what some people are. Look how some people behave. Well, what kind of system reinforces that behavior?
Exactly.
The system that completely treats them like they can't be trusted. One of the things that you talk about in the dialogues between boy and dad in the video that were great was, school making people good citizens.
Daddy, why do I have to go to school?
So you can learn things.
But Adam Kotsko said...
Kotsko? Sounds like a bloody Russian to me. Don't listen to him.
Daddy, are you racist?
Yes. Why, aren't you?
No.
I should have expected as much from a bloody Welsh half-breed. God, I hate your mother.
Well, back to the point. Why do
School teaches you to be an upstanding citizen, boy. Learn to be a decent member of society.
Well, my observations here in the United States are we have a lot of like very, very obedient and unquestioning people. We have the largest scale disaster politically in my life coming up with the choices we have for president. Don't
know what you're talking about.
In 2016, it's terrifying. It's like, how did this happen? How like little thought went into like these people being the two best people. So, we have a society here that is, that talks about things like questioning authority, which is basically an empty cliche because no one actually does it in any way that's meaningful. School does produce good citizens as far as, I think our current government is concerned.
In kind of a military way, I suppose, yes.
A regimented way, an
yes,
obedient
that's the way
way.
to phrase it.
The first shows that I did for School Sucks, I said, I think school has 3 hidden lessons. I think they're obedience, conformity, and a kind of intellectual apathy. And one leads to the next. You get in line, you stay in line, and while you're in line and forced to stay there, you really don't want to think about that situation too much because it really, really sucks to be there. So the promise of public schools here is true. They did produce good citizens. So we have this self-fulfilling prophecy of schools need to be strict and authoritarian because look how dangerous some people are. I was moved by your including that story about that British reform school in your video, because in 2003, I was the lead teacher of a really, really restrictive specialized program for kids who had what they called at the time sexually reactive behavior. Basically, kids who had been through some kind of sexual abuse and had replicated that abuse on others. So they were in this almost locked down environment where a story that I've told multiple times on my show is if the kids were in a lounge, like the TV room watching TV, and a staff walked away and just left the kids out of his or her sight for just a minute, they would start chanting in unison, almost like robots, unsafe, unsafe, unsafe. They had been taught that without constant supervision, they were unsafe. And every aspect of this program, residentially, educationally...
That sounds like a sci-fi.
Yeah. Yeah, looking back on it, it really was like that. And it was every aspect. It was educational, it was residential, it was clinical. And I took the job because I wanted to move up in the organization. Nobody wanted to work at this place because of, basically what I just described. And I did it for a year. I followed their rules for a year. It was an absolute nightmare. I said, we're making these kids worse. And I was just a young guy. I was like 23 years old, 24 years old. So I sought the help of the psychologist who was in charge of that program. And I said, I really think we should change things here. And I know, I feel like on my show, I tell these stories about myself in the past as if I was like some kind of visionary. I was really just lazy about doing things that made me feel shitty, and I didn't want to do them anymore. So I don't know if I had like some kind of noble justification, but I said, can we change things? Because that was like the worst year of my life, just constantly fighting to keep these kids in line and to constantly supervise them and tell them they couldn't watch SpongeBob SquarePants because it was too risque. Like it was to that level. So the next year we just took all the restrictions off and we started a life skills curriculum, like very Sudbury-like things. And at the time I was in graduate school, so I had come across Sudbury, but I really hadn't embraced it yet. It just was doing what felt right and doing what felt natural with other human beings, which was not trying to control them, which was not telling them that I don't trust you, you shouldn't even trust yourself. We loosened all the restrictions. We started a newspaper for the whole school, which we had been isolated from, and they all had jobs. We did life skills curriculum, and in that year, everything changed for me, especially. I mean, that's the person that honestly I was the most concerned about. I was no good to the environment if I was miserable. I wasn't going to help anybody else. And I think a lot of the kids got positive benefits out of it as well. So as years went on and I started to discover a lot of the things that you talked about in the video and a lot of the benefits of Sudbury that you talked about, I felt really vindicated, where I was just, being lazy about following the school's rules. Turned out that was actually the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that message every time I hear it.